The judge ridiculed the teenager and gave him a life sentence without hesitation. The staff scoffed, the lawyer was silent, and the witnesses weren't even listened to. That all changed when the kid asked for one phone call. Half an hour later, the courtroom door swung open. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you're from. The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds of the courtroom's lobby, casting narrow golden slats on the tiled floor. It was the kind of light that should have made the place feel warm, but instead it only emphasized the coldness of the air conditioning and the colder stares of the people who worked there. The boy sat alone on the hard wooden bench, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his shoulders pulled tight and rigid. His name was Tyler. 15 years old, lanky and quiet, he wore the same navy hoodie he had on the day of his arrest, now faded at the seams and faintly stained from its time in holding. Across from him, a security officer stood watch, not because Tyler posed any danger, but because that was the policy for minors in custody. The officer didn't speak. None of them really did. They looked at him as though he were something less than human, something already defined by a rap sheet instead of the facts of his life. And Tyler, well, he had learned not to speak unless spoken to. Even that morning, when they'd walked him from the detention center to the courthouse through the back entrance, he hadn't asked why the handcuffs were necessary when he hadn't even resisted arrest. He had asked, once, at the beginning of all this, if someone could explain what was going on. That had been weeks ago, in a dimly lit interrogation room, where two detectives had taken turns asking the same questions again and again. He'd told them what had happened, what hadn't happened more precisely, but they hadn't seemed to care. The evidence, they said, was strong. They had video footage, a partial print, witness descriptions that matched. That word echoed in Tyler's head even now. Matched. It hadn't mattered that he'd been on the other side of town, waiting for a city bus that never came, the clock ticking as he counted down the minutes before curfew. It hadn't mattered that the phone in his pocket showed search history for video games and homework help, not routes or escape plans. Once the officers thought they had their suspect, they didn't look much further. Now he was here, awaiting a preliminary hearing before Judge Robert Madsen, who had a reputation for being decisive and unsympathetic, particularly in cases involving juveniles. Tyler's public defender was late. Again. He always seemed late. The courtroom door creaked open, and a bailiff peeked out, squinting at Tyler before grunting, "You, let's go." Tyler stood, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor as he followed the bailiff through the heavy wooden doors and into the main courtroom. The ceiling was high, arched with peeling paint, and the walls bore plaques and portraits of stern men from the past who had likely never questioned the system they upheld. Judge Madsen sat behind the bench, already rifling through a file with Tyler's name on it. He didn't look up as Tyler was led to the defense table. A few feet away, the prosecutor stood in a crisp gray suit, immaculate and prepared. "Where's your lawyer?" the judge asked without looking at him. "He said he was coming," Tyler replied quietly. The judge raised his eyes just long enough to scowl. "We'll proceed. He can join when he gets here." The hearing began with the prosecutor reading the charges: robbery, possession of stolen property, resisting arrest. Tyler flinched at each one. They were just words, but each landed like a stone against the fragile wall of his composure. The judge's questions came next. Tyler tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't used to speaking in front of adults who already thought he was lying. Every time he began a sentence, it was interrupted, dismissed, or ignored. When his public defender finally arrived, he looked disheveled, out of breath, his tie askew. He offered the judge a rushed apology, and then took his place beside Tyler without even acknowledging him. The rest of the hearing felt like a blur. Paperwork shuffled, legal jargon flew, and all the while, Tyler sat there, feeling smaller and smaller, like he was vanishing inside his own skin. By the time the judge denied the motion for dismissal and set a trial date, Tyler was staring blankly at the floor, his fingers digging into the wood of the table. As they led him out, he caught a murmur from someone in the courtroom gallery. A woman, maybe a clerk or one of the stenographers, whispering to another, "Just another one of those kids trying to act innocent. You'd think they'd come up with better lies by now." That night, back in the juvenile detention center, Tyler lay on the thin mattress of his cot, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The room smelled of bleach and mildew, and the sounds of boys shouting from other cells echoed through the halls. He hadn't cried since his arrest. Not when they cuffed him in front of strangers, not when they'd taken his shoelaces and belt, not even when he'd seen his mother break down during the first visitation. But tonight, lying in that cold bed with the quiet settling around him like dust, he felt the tears threaten. The guards had mocked him earlier. One of them, Officer Pelton, had said with a smirk, "Maybe if you spent less time robbing stores and more time calling your daddy, you wouldn't be here." Another had laughed, "Assuming he has one." The joke wasn't just cruel, it stung because there was truth buried inside it. Tyler didn't talk about his father. Nobody knew who he was. His mother had never spoken much about the man who had walked out before Tyler was even old enough to remember. But Tyler had questions. Always had. And lately, the questions had returned with urgency. He sat up, the old springs of the bed groaning beneath him, and reached for the small notebook they allowed him to keep. Inside were scribbles of thoughts, memories, and numbers. One number stood out. A phone number, written years ago on a faded slip of paper his mother had tucked into a book. She'd said it was someone important, someone she never wanted to talk about, but also never wanted Tyler to forget. He'd never called it. But now, with nothing left to lose, he wondered if he should. The next day brought another round of humiliation. During a lunch line mix-up, Tyler was shoved by one of the older inmates. When he tried to explain it wasn't his fault, a guard barked at him to stop causing trouble. When he tried to speak up, they laughed and pushed him into a cleaning shift as punishment. The other kids started calling him mute or robot, teasing him for his silence. A few were worse, accusing him of pretending to be smart, acting innocent. "You think you're better than us?" one sneered during lights out. "You think your little wrongly accused act makes you special." Tyler didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling, clenching his jaw until it ached. Days passed. The injustice settled like fog, thick and constant. The guards treated him like he was already convicted. The other kids followed suit. Even his public defender seemed less and less interested, brushing off Tyler's questions with hollow reassurances. And the weight of it all pressed harder on his chest until one night, during the limited phone block, Tyler stood up and walked to the wall-mounted unit with lead in his steps. He dialed the number. It rang once, then twice. And then a voice answered. Calm, gruff, unmistakable. Tyler's fingers trembled around the receiver. He didn't say hello. He didn't even say his name. He just whispered, "I think I need you." There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a quiet reply. "I'm on my way." The line went dead. Tyler stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, not yet understanding what he had just set in motion. But outside, Far from the detention center's gray walls and flickering lights, something stirred in the wind. Because the man on the other end of that phone call wasn't just anyone. And Tyler had just awoken a part of the world that wasn't used to being told no. A part that didn't like injustice. A part that went by the name Chuck Norris. And Chuck had just learned someone had put hands on his son. The wind outside the juvenile detention center had picked up, rustling dead leaves across the empty parking lot as the night crept deeper into silence. Inside, however, a different kind of quiet had settled. Tyler sat on the edge of his cot, his fingers still tingling from the weight of the phone receiver. The call had lasted only a few seconds, yet the words exchanged seemed to echo in his chest like distant thunder. He didn't know what he expected when he made it. He didn't even know what would happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe that voice on the other end would disappear like everything else in his life had. But somewhere deep down, in a place even fear couldn't reach, Tyler felt something had shifted. Something was coming. The next morning, the guards made a show of ignoring him. They didn't bark orders or single him out like usual, but they didn't make room for kindness either. Tyler moved through the day like a shadow, taking his tray in the cafeteria without a word, sitting by himself as always. The other boys threw glances his way, some amused, some suspicious. It was as if they sensed something had changed, but didn't know what. He didn't try to explain. What would he say? That he'd called a father he barely knew, a man he hadn't seen since he was a toddler? That a part of him still doubted if the man would even show up? But doubt was just the surface. Beneath it, another feeling began to grow, a slow burning heat in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was hope or anger, or both tangled together, but it felt like armor. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders lessened, and he dared to sit up a little straighter. By mid-morning, whispers began circulating among the staff. A call had come through the administrative office, not from a lawyer, not from a parent, but from someone higher, someone who didn't speak in questions but gave instructions with finality. Officer Hayes, a man who usually strutted through the halls like he owned every inch of it, was seen leaving the warden's office with a pale, drawn face. Others noticed a marked increase in tension among the supervisors, as if something had startled the chain of command. Tyler remained unaware of the details, but he felt the ripple effects. During group study hour, one of the guards who had previously shoved him into cleanup duty now walked past him without comment. A counselor who had dismissed his request for a phone call a week ago suddenly asked if he needed anything, and when lunch came, he found a carton of milk on his tray, the kind he hadn't seen since his first week. Small things, subtle, but they didn't go unnoticed. In the courtroom, too, things were stirring. Judge Madson's morning docket was interrupted by a call from the presiding chief of the district court, a rare occurrence that caused the judge to frown deeply. The call was brief, but Madson's face tightened as he listened, then went even tighter when he hung up. No explanations were offered, but his clerk would later describe the moment as like a bomb had gone off in his inbox. Unbeknownst to Tyler, the phone call had reached not only the detention center, but multiple offices within the justice system. A private request, followed by a formal query, and then a series of confidential communications had begun circulating, all bearing the same unmistakable name at the bottom: Charles Norris. Meanwhile, back at the center, the atmosphere continued to shift. That afternoon, Tyler was called out of his cell, not for punishment or transport, but for a scheduled behavioral evaluation, something he hadn't been assigned before. They led him to a room with soft lighting and a carpeted floor, where a woman in a blouse with floral patterns offered him a chair and asked if he wanted water. He sat, uncertain. The woman smiled politely, too politely. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. Tyler narrowed his eyes. "Okay. Are you comfortable here?" He looked around. "No." She chuckled as if she expected that. "Has anyone mistreated you?" He didn't answer. "Tyler," she continued gently, "this isn't a trick question. I need you to be honest with me. Has anyone here made you feel unsafe?" Tyler tilted his head. "Why now?" She hesitated. "Because we're reviewing all cases with open inquiries." That wasn't an answer. He knew it, and so did she. But something in her tone told him that her presence was just another piece of something bigger. When he returned to his unit later that evening, things felt different. Some of the other boys avoided him now, not with fear exactly, but uncertainty. One of them, a boy named Jason, who usually made snide remarks every time Tyler walked by, kept his mouth shut for the first time in weeks. Even the guards walked with less swagger, as if they were being watched. And, in a way, they were. Because around that time, Chuck Norris landed in the city. He didn't arrive in a limo or with a camera crew, but in a dark SUV with tinted windows and a quiet engine. He wore a worn leather jacket, jeans, and a pair of boots that had seen more than one battlefield. His expression was unreadable, but his pace was purposeful. He walked into the courthouse without needing to identify himself. The front desk recognized him immediately. Word spread fast, and where most men relied on business cards or titles to assert power, Chuck Norris only needed his name. He didn't make demands, he made observations. He asked for files, requested transcripts, and when a certain clerk hesitated, he looked at him once and the hesitation vanished. Within an hour, Chuck had read the arrest reports, watched the interrogation footage, and reviewed the evidence log. He found inconsistencies. The security footage timestamp didn't match the public bus schedule from the area Tyler claimed to be in. The gloves allegedly found in Tyler's backpack had no clear chain of custody, and the fingerprint match was only partial. So partial, in fact, that the lab notes had been stamped inconclusive before someone crossed it out. That same day, Chuck appeared at the office of Judge Madsen. No appointment, no protocol, just a knock and then the sound of the door opening. Judge Madsen looked up from his desk, startled. "Mr. Norris, I wasn't expecting. You've been trying a boy who never had a chance," Chuck said calmly. "That ends now." Madsen bristled. "This court doesn't respond to intimidation, no matter who it's coming from." Chuck stepped further inside, slow and deliberate. "I'm not here to intimidate. I'm here to expose what you let happen." That night, as darkness fell across the city, the storm truly began. Chuck didn't go to the press, he went higher. Calls to the Attorney General, quiet conversations with oversight committees. Files were sent, whistleblowers contacted. Within 24 hours, the Internal Affairs Division of the Juvenile Justice Department launched an emergency audit, and Tyler's name was right at the top. But Tyler still didn't know any of this. He only felt the tremors, felt the way people moved differently around him, the way a new supervisor came by and said, "We'll be reviewing your case soon, son," and even used his name. The way a fresh change of clothes appeared in his cell without him asking. Something was coming. He just didn't know what shape it would take. The answer arrived the next morning. He was called out of his cell again, but this time not to the counselor's office or the group center. They brought him to the visitor's wing. The hallway leading there was quiet, but every step he took felt heavier than the last. When the door opened and he stepped inside, he froze. There, sitting at the table, was a man who looked older than Tyler remembered, but unmistakable. Strong jawline, weathered eyes, presence like steel. Chuck Norris. Tyler couldn't move. Chuck looked up and gave a slight nod. Not a smile. Not yet. "Hello, son," he said. Tyler swallowed hard, his throat tight with everything he hadn't said for years. "I came," Chuck added, "because someone needed to." And with that, the silence between father and son, years long, fractured, aching, began to crack, letting in the first rays of something new. A reckoning had begun, one that wouldn't stop with Tyler, one that had already begun to rattle the foundations of the system around them, and Chuck Norris was just getting started. The moment the visitation room door closed behind him, Tyler felt the weight of silence settle over the space like a thick fog. The man across from him, his father, Chuck Norris, sat perfectly still, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. There was no trace of the bravado Tyler had seen in old interviews or martial arts videos, only a calm, steady intensity. Chuck's eyes studied him not like an interrogator, but like a craftsman inspecting a damaged but recoverable artifact. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was Tyler who broke the silence first, not with a full sentence, just a faint, choked question laced with disbelief. But the words weren't necessary. The silence between them contained years of abandonment, aching questions, and private hopes long buried under disappointment. Chuck nodded slowly, as if affirming what hadn't been spoken. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, the edge of his hand brushing the smooth surface as he regarded his son. "I'm here now," he said finally, "and I'm not leaving until this is made right." Tyler didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had closed around a swell of emotions too tangled to sort. There was no time to unravel the past, no luxury to demand apologies or explanations. What mattered was that he was no longer alone in the fight. Within hours of that visit, subtle changes began to roll out like quiet thunder. A new attorney arrived at the juvenile facility, high profile, experienced, and clearly not someone assigned by the overburdened public defender's office. Her name was Samantha Kwan, and her reputation preceded her. She arrived with a briefcase full of case law, a court order for full-file access, and an unmistakable air of purpose. The guards, already on edge since Chuck's visit, now seemed to operate under invisible scrutiny. Every document, every interaction was suddenly recorded, copied, and logged. Back at the courthouse, Judge Braddock, who had taken over Tyler's hearings after the first judge abruptly recused himself, reviewed the emergency appeal paperwork submitted that same morning. The language was precise but firm, pointing out gross procedural violations, insufficient counsel, and unexplained delays in evidence disclosure. Attached to the motion were affidavits from independent forensic analysts, all of which cast serious doubt on the integrity of the original arrest and interrogation. More damning, however, were the two sealed surveillance videos Chuck had acquired through channels only someone of his influence could access. Footage from a corner store and a metro stop timestamped Tyler miles away from the alleged scene at the exact time of the reported crime. These files had been previously unentered into the court system, either buried or willfully omitted. Their sudden appearance raised questions that made seasoned prosecutors glance at each other nervously and judges stiffen in their chairs. At the juvenile center, staff grew increasingly agitated. A week ago, they had openly mocked Tyler, laughed at his awkwardness, and assigned him extra duties with thinly veiled contempt. Now, their eyes darted to cameras more often than to inmates. Conversations dropped to whispers. One counselor who had once smirked when denying Tyler's meal request was suddenly transferred. No one explained why. Another was suspended pending an internal investigation. The word audit floated in the air like the smell of smoke before a fire. Tyler, meanwhile, struggled to make sense of the rapid changes. He still slept in the same narrow bed, still ate from plastic trays, still heard the clang of barred doors echo through the halls at night. But now, when he asked for paper to draw, it arrived without delay. When he requested an extra blanket, it was granted. And, most confusing of all, when he was escorted to his next court appearance, the guards didn't shove him or jeer. They simply opened the door and followed orders. The courtroom this time was full, not with spectators, but with legal observers, media correspondents, and Department of Justice representatives, all quietly tracking the unfolding story. Tyler, dressed in a plain collared shirt that didn't quite fit and slacks a size too large, walked in behind Samantha Kwan. The chains on his ankles jingled softly, but no one dared treat him like a criminal anymore. Not here, not now. Judge Braddock called the room to order and scanned the documents in front of him. He was not a man easily rattled, yet even he couldn't hide the slight twitch in his brow as he flipped through the stack of new evidence. The court-appointed prosecutor tried to mount a rebuttal, arguing procedural precedent, but his voice faltered halfway through his second paragraph when Samantha presented a printed email thread between a detention staff member and the original prosecutor, an email suggesting deliberate delay in filing exculpatory footage. Tyler watched it all unfold in near disbelief. It was as if the curtain had been pulled back on a theater he'd always been trapped in, but never allowed to look behind. Now, suddenly, everyone was seeing what he had felt all along: the lies, the mockery, the smugness of people who thought no one was watching. Samantha leaned toward him once during the session, her voice a whisper. "They're on their heels. That's where we want them." But even as momentum shifted in his favor, Tyler couldn't shake the haunting memory of what it had felt like when no one believed him. That sharp disbelief was still fresh in his mind, raw and splintered, like an old wound reopening whenever someone said his name with sympathy instead of derision. He didn't know how to feel about this sudden interest. Part of him wanted to scream at them all, to ask why it took Chuck Norris and a media scandal for someone to finally listen. But another part knew this wasn't the time for questions. This was the time to survive. When court recessed, Tyler was taken not back to his cell, but to a secure room at the center with windows and real chairs. His meals came warm now. No one cursed at him when handing them over. A television was installed on the wall, though always set to mute, and a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird lay on the desk. Someone thought they were being clever, maybe even inspiring. Tyler read the first few pages, then closed it. The story wasn't over yet, and this wasn't fiction. Meanwhile, Chuck moved quietly through the channels of power, speaking less and doing more. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't pose for photos. What he did do was appear in the offices of people who rarely saw him outside Hollywood: judicial oversight officials, internal investigators, federal auditors. Everywhere he went, files were opened, voices were lowered, promises were made. The warden at the juvenile center, long considered untouchable, was suspended pending investigation. A staff supervisor resigned before charges could be filed. and the judge who had first denied Tyler's bail was now the subject of a judicial review. His courtroom decisions cross-referenced with racial bias data and campaign contributions from private juvenile detention firms. And through all of this, Tyler remained silent. Not by choice, but by necessity. He had been silent too long to know what words to use now. So instead, he sketched. In the quiet room with its cheap table and bolted-down chair, he drew faces. The boy who once gave him his last packet of juice in the yard, the old janitor who slipped him extra apples, the counselor who said nothing but once let him read her copy of Time magazine. Every face was a testimony, every line a reminder of what the world chose to overlook. Days passed, then a week, then another court session. This one was different. The prosecutor didn't argue much. Most of their case had unraveled under the weight of internal misconduct, missing evidence, and procedural failures. Samantha presented the final piece, a sworn affidavit from a staff member who confessed that they'd been instructed to lose the video footage because the kids got no one who'd notice. When the witness, his voice shaking, read that line aloud in the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Judge Braddock sat back in his chair, hands steepled beneath his chin. He made no pronouncement that day, no ruling. Instead, he scheduled a final hearing for determination of dismissal or continuation of charges, which everyone in the room understood was a thinly veiled path toward exoneration. What remained was bureaucratic delay, not doubt. As they left the courtroom that day, Samantha squeezed Tyler's shoulder gently. "You're almost there," she said, but Tyler didn't respond. He wasn't almost anywhere. Not yet. His body might soon be free, but the scars on his mind had only begun to form. He turned, looking past the reporters and cameras, toward the doors beyond which Chuck stood waiting. The man who had once walked away. The man who had come back. Tyler took a deep breath and walked forward, not just toward the door, but toward the unknown. The chapter was far from finished, but for the first time, he had a pen in his own hand. For the first time since Tyler had been taken from his school in handcuffs, he stepped into the juvenile courtroom not as a forgotten name in a thick docket, but as the focus of national attention. The rows of benches, once filled with bored clerks and indifferent staff, were now lined with reporters, legal observers, civil rights attorneys, and even off-duty judges watching closely from the shadows. His case had become a symbol, not by his choosing, but by sheer consequence of the firestorm ignited by Chuck's return and the avalanche of misconduct that followed. The atmosphere buzzed with tension as Judge Braddock entered the courtroom. His eyes swept the room, lingering a second longer than usual on Chuck Norris, who sat beside Samantha Kwan in the front row, his presence radiating silent challenge. Braddock's expression was unreadable. His black robe hung perfectly straight, his silver-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. He gave no hint of personal discomfort, but the rhythm of his gavel strike was slightly off, a fraction of a beat too fast. "Court is now in session," he announced. "The matter of Tyler Reese continues under motion for dismissal and consideration of full judicial review." Tyler sat at the defense table, no longer in a jumpsuit, but in the simple collared shirt Samantha had brought him. It was one size too large, but clean. His wrists were still cuffed, procedure, they said, but no longer chained to the chair. Even small victories carried meaning. Samantha rose and began the defense's final presentation. She spoke plainly, without the usual courtroom theatrics, her tone measured but unwavering. She detailed the cascade of constitutional violations, the denial of legal counsel during interrogation, the falsified police report, the missing surveillance video later recovered through Chuck's contacts, the refusal to allow a phone call to a guardian, and the disturbing pattern of abuse Tyler had suffered within the juvenile system. As she spoke, Tyler's mind drifted only briefly to the memories she described: the cell, the bruises, the mockery from guards who had sneered when he cried in his bunk at night, the one who had once whispered in his ear that no one cared where he was or why he was here, that he was just another number. He had believed that voice for too long, but not anymore. The prosecution's response was tepid at best. With their evidence in shambles and internal misconduct still under review, the assistant district attorney struggled to maintain the facade of impartiality. He offered a few half-hearted defenses, technicalities, procedural delays, but every word rang hollow in the wake of Samantha's evidence and the national scrutiny. He knew it, the judge knew it, and everyone watching knew it too. Then came the turning point no one expected. From the back of the courtroom, a soft voice asked permission to approach. All heads turned as a man in plain clothes stood, holding a folder thick with documents. He introduced himself as Gregory Wynn, a former assistant to the county forensic division. He had resigned 3 months ago after becoming uncomfortable with patterns of suppression, but had remained silent until now out of fear for his career. "I can no longer remain silent," he told the court, his voice trembling but determined. He produced a copy of a suppressed internal memo, a lab analysis that had conclusively ruled Tyler out as a DNA match to material found at the crime scene. The report had been signed, time-stamped, and archived before the trial, but it had never reached the defense. "Someone made sure it didn't," Wynn said. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Samantha calmly requested that the exhibit be entered into the record. Judge Braddock asked for a 5-minute recess, but everyone knew it was more than a procedural pause. It was a reckoning. When court resumed, the judge returned with a markedly different posture. His words were careful but clear. "This court finds that the integrity of the prosecution's case has been fundamentally compromised. The defendant's rights were violated repeatedly and egregiously. Therefore, this court vacates the conviction of Tyler Reese effective immediately and orders his release pending further review by federal authorities." Tyler didn't move at first. The words took a second to land. Release. Vacated. No more shackles. No more concrete walls. He looked at Samantha, who gave a nod so small only he could see it. He turned to Chuck, who stood slowly, his hands clenched in quiet resolve. There was no triumphant outburst, no shouting or applause, just the hush of something too sacred for noise, a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. That night, Tyler was escorted out of the juvenile facility, not through the back loading bay, but through the front entrance. The guards, who once laughed, now avoided his gaze. The staff, who had ignored his pleas for a phone call, looked away as he passed. He stepped into the cool night air and saw his mother waiting by the curb, tears running freely down her cheeks. She pulled him into a hug that made time collapse, and for the first time in weeks, Tyler let himself cry, not from fear, but from relief. Chuck stood slightly apart, letting them have the moment. When Tyler looked up, their eyes met. The older man gave a simple nod, the kind men gave to each other when no words were needed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. But it was a start. The following days moved fast. Federal investigators launched formal inquiries into the conduct of the juvenile facility staff. The police department opened internal affairs cases, and Judge Braddock recused himself from several pending trials, citing unavoidable conflict of interest. Local news anchors debated whether the case signaled systemic failure or a singular lapse, but the people who had been watching closely already knew the answer. For Tyler, however, the world still felt unsteady. Freedom wasn't a light switch. He struggled with sleep, startled by every knock on the door or unexpected phone call. His mother kept a quiet vigil in the apartment, checking in more often than she admitted. Chuck visited when invited, never staying too long, but always leaving behind something useful: a book, a sketch pad, a meal. One afternoon, Tyler sat on his bedroom floor with his sketch pad open, trying to capture the moment the judge had said the words that set him free. But the image kept coming out wrong. The judge's face blurred. The courtroom walls collapsed inward. The chains looked thicker than he remembered. Frustrated, he put the pencil down and walked outside. The sunlight hurt his eyes at first. Too bright, too clean, but he stood still and let it touch him. A breeze passed through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the rhythmic pop of a basketball court. Laughter, footsteps, the real world moving forward. His mother watched from the kitchen window, her hand pressed lightly against the glass. She saw him there, standing on the porch, looking like a boy who had aged 10 years in 1 month. He had been broken in places she couldn't reach, but not beyond repair. That night, Tyler found the courage to ask Chuck the question that had weighed on him since the day he made the phone call. Why had he left? Why had he not been there from the start? Chuck didn't offer excuses. He spoke quietly, honestly, about fear, about the sacrifices he thought he had to make, about believing Tyler's mother had it under control and lying to himself so he could sleep at night. "I failed you," he said simply, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Tyler didn't respond right away. He sat with the words, tested their weight. Then, slowly, he picked up his sketch pad and began to draw. Not the courtroom, not the prison, but a face. Chuck's face. Not perfect, not heroic, just human. When he finished, he held it out. Chuck looked at the portrait, nodded once, and said nothing, but Tyler knew what it meant. The system had tried to erase him, tried to strip him of dignity, of voice, of hope. But he had survived. Not just because of Chuck, not just because of the legal team or the evidence, but because he had held on to something deeper than fear. The truth, and now that it was out, there would be no putting it back. The morning sun spilled through the windows of Tyler's apartment, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the quiet. The world outside had begun to adjust to the rhythm of spring, but inside the small living room time still moved cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the family in the aftermath of the trial. Tyler sat at the kitchen table, a mug of cooling tea untouched in front of him. The events of the last week remained fresh in his mind, each memory stitched with both clarity and disbelief. His freedom had returned not with a shout, but with the soft click of a courtroom door, and though he was home, every shadow still looked like a guard, and every silence still echoed like a cell. Across from him, his mother read through a thick envelope the Department of Justice had sent the day before. Inside were summaries of the investigations underway, inquiries into the juvenile facility, the judge's docket history, the local precinct's arrest records, and a formal acknowledgement that Tyler's civil rights had been violated. There were also apologies, carefully worded, impersonal statements signed by officials who had never met her son and never would. She folded the documents slowly, methodically, as if by neatly containing them, she could also contain the grief they had caused. Chuck arrived just before noon. He didn't knock anymore. Tyler had told him he didn't have to. His presence had shifted from that of a guest to something closer to family, though neither of them had dared to speak those words aloud. He brought with him two things: a stack of letters from supporters around the country, some addressed to Tyler, others to Chuck himself, and a folder marked Next Steps, which Tyler eyed warily. "You don't have to read it all today," Chuck said, placing the folder gently on the table. "Just when you're ready." Tyler nodded but said nothing. His thoughts were already elsewhere. Since the day the judge vacated his conviction, reporters had been calling. Advocacy groups had sent requests for interviews. A documentary filmmaker wanted to speak with him. His case had become a lightning rod, and everyone wanted a quote, a soundbite, a moment on camera. But Tyler had yet to answer a single request. The attention felt too large, too alien, like a flood pressing against glass. All he wanted was to find his footing again, to be allowed to rebuild himself in silence. But silence, he'd learned, was never neutral. Later that day, as Chuck prepared to leave, a package arrived by courier. It bore the official seal of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Inside was a formal letter of commendation, not for Tyler, but for Chuck. It thanked him for his intervention, acknowledged the pressure his presence had placed on a system resistant to accountability, and hinted at internal policy changes his actions had accelerated. But as Chuck read it aloud, Tyler noticed something missing. There was no mention of the damage done, of the time lost, of the boy the system had tried to erase. It was as though Chuck had disrupted a process, not saved a life. Tyler stood abruptly. "They still don't get it," he said quietly. "This wasn't about heroics. This was about what they let happen in the first place." Chuck didn't argue. He simply folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. That night, Tyler went for a walk alone. The streets felt both familiar and new, as if the city had shifted slightly during his absence. He passed the library, the corner store, the alley behind the GameStop, the places where his freedom had unraveled one thread at a time. And then he found himself standing in front of the courthouse. It was closed, its steps empty, the grand facade bathed in moonlight. He stared at the building for a long time, remembering the weight of the handcuffs, the cold bench outside the holding cell, the silence of the courtroom as his fate was sealed. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. Just standing there, he knew he had survived it. Not just the institution, but the idea that he was powerless against it. The following week, an opportunity came. A local high school civics teacher reached out through Samantha Kwan, asking if Tyler might speak to her class. She didn't want a media circus or a presentation, just a conversation. At first, Tyler hesitated. Then, remembering the feeling of standing outside the courthouse, he agreed. He arrived with a few sketches tucked into his backpack. Not evidence, not art for display, just fragments of memory he had managed to capture on paper. The classroom buzzed with the energy of students barely interested in anything beyond their phones, but as Tyler spoke, that energy shifted. He didn't tell them what to think or who to blame. He simply told them what had happened, how he had felt, how easy it had been for the system to pretend he didn't matter. When he finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "What do you want to do now?" she asked. Tyler thought for a moment. "I want to make sure no one else disappears the way I did." That answer seemed to ripple through the room like a switch being flipped. Afterward, several students came up to him, not for autographs or photos, but to share their own fears, their own stories. A few admitted they had older siblings or cousins who had been through something similar. One boy said, "You sound like my brother," before turning away with wet eyes. Chuck heard about the visit through Samantha and didn't say much, but when he next saw Tyler, he handed him a blank notebook and said only, "Keep telling the truth." In the months that followed, investigations continued to unearth misconduct at every level of Tyler's case. The juvenile detention facility director was suspended, then resigned. The judge who presided over Tyler's initial hearing faced censure and eventually stepped down. The arresting officer's record was called into question, revealing a pattern of targeting vulnerable youth. A civil lawsuit was filed on Tyler's behalf, not just for compensation, but as a formal challenge to the structural abuse he had endured. But the most significant change came quietly. A coalition of educators, advocates, and attorneys formed a task force on juvenile justice reform, using Tyler's case as a starting point. Chuck lent his voice to the cause publicly for the first time, not as a celebrity, but as a father who had once failed to show up. His speeches weren't polished or political, but they resonated because they were honest. He didn't pretend to have the answers. He only insisted that people stop looking away. Tyler became something else, not a victim, not a symbol, but a bridge. He spoke to students, teachers, probation officers, community leaders. He drew portraits of those still inside, pairing them with quotes from letters or visits, creating an exhibit titled "Forgotten Faces." It toured several cities. Visitors lingered not just on the images, but on the silence between them. At one gallery opening, a boy about Tyler's age stood for nearly 20 minutes in front of a sketch of an inmate named Jerome, who had been 17 when sentenced to 30 years. The boy didn't speak. When he finally moved on, he left behind a note that simply read, "Thank you for seeing us." That note stayed with Tyler for weeks. It reminded him why he had chosen to speak up, why he had chosen to stay visible. The world wanted stories with neat endings. Bad guys exposed, good guys redeemed, justice restored. But real life didn't follow those arcs. Real life was about the spaces in between, the hard conversations, the slow rebuilding, the moments when the truth had to be chosen again and again. Chuck eventually returned to his quiet home in Texas, but he and Tyler stayed in touch. They didn't speak every day, and not every call was easy. But each time, Chuck asked, "How's the work?" And Tyler answered honestly, even when the answer was, "It's hard." One evening, Tyler received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a photograph, a younger Chuck standing in front of an old martial arts school, smiling broadly. On the back, Chuck had written, "We all start somewhere." Tyler pinned it above his desk next to a photo of himself and his mother taken the day his conviction was overturned. In it, she's smiling with her whole face, and he's blinking into the sunlight, free at last. It wasn't a perfect picture. He looked tired, his shirt was wrinkled, and the courthouse steps behind them loomed like ghosts. But to Tyler, it captured something true. He was still healing, still learning. But he was no longer invisible. The system had tried to erase him, but the truth had drawn him back. And now he was drawing others forward, one story at a time. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel. You won't believe what happens in some of them. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.